What if I told you that the moment an empath stops playing the emotional game, the narcissist doesn't just lose control, they begin circling you as if their survival depends on it? Because the one thing a narcissist fears more than being exposed is losing access to the emotional fuel they once controlled. And when an empath flips a very specific internal switch, the entire dynamic quietly begins to reverse. Before we go deeper, if you've ever dealt with a narcissist or are learning how to protect your peace, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps this message reach people who may still be stuck in these confusing patterns. The most powerful shift an empath can make in a narcissistic dynamic is emotional detachment. In the early stages of these relationships, empaths often respond with deep understanding and emotional investment. They listen closely, they try to solve problems, and they often believe that with enough patience, things will eventually improve. When conflict happens, the empath usually explains themselves, tries to calm things down, or takes responsibility just to restore peace. For a narcissist, these reactions become extremely valuable because they confirm that the empath is emotionally hooked and still willing to fight for the relationship. Over time, this emotional engagement becomes the very fuel that keeps the narcissistic cycle alive. Every emotional reaction, whether it is sadness, frustration, long explanations, or attempts to repair the connection, signals to the narcissist that they still hold influence over the empath's feelings. Even negative reactions can feel rewarding to someone who thrives on control and validation. The more the empath reacts, the more the narcissist feels powerful because the emotional environment still revolves around them. But when an empath starts to emotionally detach, the dynamic quietly begins to shift. Emotional detachment does not mean losing kindness or empathy. It means the empath stops feeding the emotional drama. They respond calmly, briefly, and sometimes not at all. Instead of defending themselves again and again, they preserve their energy. Instead of chasing clarity or closure, they allow distance and silence to exist. The narcissist, who once relied on predictable emotional responses, suddenly encounters a kind of stillness they cannot easily manipulate. That stillness removes the reward system the narcissist depended on, creating confusion and pressure on their side of the dynamic. The strategies that once triggered emotional reactions, guilt, blame, criticism, or sudden affection, no longer produce the same predictable outcome. Without that steady emotional supply, the narcissist may begin trying harder to regain attention, validation, or engagement. The second shift that deeply unsettles a narcissist is the collapse of narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is the constant stream of attention, emotional reactions, admiration, or even conflict that keeps a narcissist feeling powerful and significant. For many narcissists, relationships are not built on mutual connection, but on access to this psychological fuel. When an empath is deeply engaged in the relationship, they often provide this supply without even realizing it. Their empathy makes them attentive. Their patience keeps them present during conflict, and their emotional openness creates a steady flow of reactions that the narcissist feeds on. At first, the narcissist becomes comfortable with this arrangement. They learn exactly which behaviors will provoke a reaction and which tactics will keep the empath emotionally invested. Whether it is praise, criticism, blame, or sudden affection, each interaction produces the emotional energy they rely on. In their mind, this supply becomes predictable and almost guaranteed. The empath becomes a stable source of validation, attention, and emotional engagement that keeps the narcissist's sense of control intact. But the moment the empath begins to step back, something important begins to change. When emotional reactions fade and attention becomes limited, the narcissist suddenly experiences a shortage of the very thing that kept them stable. Conversations become shorter, arguments stop escalating, and the emotional intensity that once filled the relationship slowly fades away. What used to be a constant stream of reactions turns into silence or calm responses that offer no emotional reward. This absence creates a kind of psychological vacuum. The narcissist may begin trying different strategies to restore the supply they once received so easily. They might become unusually charming, suddenly attentive, or attempt to provoke a reaction through criticism or guilt. Behind these behaviors is a growing discomfort because the emotional resource they once controlled is no longer freely available. The third shift that disrupts a narcissist's control is the presence of boundaries that cannot be manipulated. In the beginning of many narcissistic dynamics, boundaries are often flexible or unclear. An empath may express discomfort or ask for respect, but when conflict arises, they sometimes soften those limits in order to maintain harmony. They may forgive quickly, give repeated chances, or explain their boundaries in ways that invite negotiation. A narcissist quickly learns that these limits are not fixed walls, but doors that can be pushed open with pressure, guilt, or emotional intensity. Over time, the narcissist becomes used to testing these limits. They may ignore requests, shift blame, twist conversations, or escalate arguments just to see how far the empath will bend. And when the empath eventually gives in to restore peace, the narcissist interprets this as confirmation that the boundary was never truly solid. Each time this happens, their sense of control grows stronger because they believe the empath's limits can always be reshaped. But something powerful happens when the empath begins to establish boundaries that are clear, calm, and consistent. Instead of explaining over and over or defending themselves for hours, they communicate their limit once and then step back. They stop engaging in endless debates meant to wear them down. When the boundary is crossed, they respond with action rather than emotional negotiation. Their tone remains steady and their decision stays unchanged. For the narcissist, this is deeply unsettling. Manipulation thrives on flexibility, confusion, and emotional pressure. When those tactics no longer change the outcome, the narcissist begins to realize that the usual strategies are failing. The empath's calm consistency creates a barrier that cannot be pushed open with drama or charm, and that stability quietly disrupts the power dynamic the narcissist once relied on. Another powerful factor that begins to surface in this dynamic is the narcissist's deep and often hidden fear of abandonment. On the outside, narcissists can appear extremely confident, independent, and emotionally detached. They may act as though they do not need anyone and can replace people easily. This image of self-sufficiency is part of the persona they build to maintain control and superiority. But underneath that exterior often sits a fragile sense of self that depends heavily on external validation and attention from others. When an empath is fully engaged in the relationship, that hidden fear rarely becomes visible. The narcissist feels secure knowing the empath is emotionally invested, responsive, and willing to stay even during conflict. The empath's patience and understanding provide reassurance that the relationship will continue no matter how unstable things become. As long as the empath keeps explaining, forgiving, and reconnecting, the narcissist rarely has to face the possibility of losing that source of emotional supply. But once the empath begins to pull back emotionally, the atmosphere starts to change in subtle ways. The familiar reactions that once reassured the narcissist are no longer there. Conversations may become shorter, emotional debates disappear, and the empath's energy becomes more self focused rather than relationship focused. This shift quietly signals something the narcissist finds extremely uncomfortable: the possibility that the empath may truly be leaving the emotional game. That possibility can activate the narcissist's deeper insecurities. Even if they never admit it openly, the idea of losing someone who once provided consistent validation can create tension and urgency. The narcissist may suddenly become more attentive, curious, or reactive because they sense that the emotional safety they once relied on is no longer guaranteed. The fifth shift that begins to reshape the entire dynamic is the psychological power shift. In narcissistic relationships, power often operates quietly beneath the surface. At the start, the narcissist usually holds most of the control because they influence the emotional tone of the relationship. They decide when affection appears, when distance happens, and when conflict begins or ends. The empath, driven by connection and understanding, often reacts to these changes rather than directing them. Over time, this creates an imbalance where the narcissist becomes the emotional center of the relationship. As long as the empath continues responding to the narcissist's moods, criticisms, or sudden affection, the power structure remains stable. The narcissist sets the emotional pace and the empath adjusts in order to maintain the relationship. Even when the empath disagrees or feels hurt, they may still engage in long explanations or attempts to repair the situation. From the narcissist's perspective, this constant engagement confirms that they still hold influence over the emotional environment. But when the empath begins to change their approach, the balance of control slowly begins to shift. Instead of reacting immediately, they pause. Instead of chasing resolution, they allow silence to exist. Their emotional energy becomes more focused on personal well being rather than managing the narcissist's reactions. Without dramatic confrontations or emotional pleading, the empath simply stops participating in the old pattern. This quiet shift can feel deeply unsettling to the narcissist because the dynamic they relied on is no longer functioning in the same way. The person who once reacted predictably is now calm, selective, and less available for emotional manipulation. Without the usual responses to guide the interaction, the narcissist may start trying harder to regain influence, often by paying closer attention to the empath's behavior and attempting to reestablish the control they once assumed was permanent. The sixth shift that begins to disturb a narcissist's sense of control is the use of silence as a way of removing influence. In many narcissistic dynamics, communication is not simply about understanding each other. It often becomes a tool for control. Arguments, emotional confrontations, long explanations, and repeated discussions all keep the narcissist at the center of the interaction. Even when the conversation is painful or exhausting, it still gives the narcissist something they crave: attention and emotional engagement. Empaths are naturally inclined to communicate openly. They often believe that if they explain their feelings clearly enough, the other person will eventually understand. They may spend hours trying to clarify misunderstandings, defend themselves against accusations, or repair emotional damage caused by hurtful behavior. While these intentions come from a place of sincerity, they can unintentionally keep the narcissistic cycle alive because the narcissist continues receiving a steady stream of emotional responses. But when the empath begins to use silence differently, the entire dynamic starts to shift. This silence is not the silent treatment used as punishment or control. Instead, it is the conscious decision to stop participating in unnecessary emotional battles. The empath no longer feels compelled to respond to every criticism, accusation, or provocation. They may listen briefly, respond calmly, or simply choose not to engage in conversations designed to trigger conflict. For the narcissist, this absence of reaction creates a kind of psychological discomfort. The strategies that once pulled the empath into arguments or emotional explanations suddenly stop working. Without those responses, the narcissist loses one of the main ways they influence the emotional environment. The quiet presence of the empath, no longer reacting in predictable ways, becomes something the narcissist cannot easily control or manipulate. The seventh shift that often emerges in this dynamic is the narcissist's growing obsession with regaining validation. For someone who relies heavily on external attention to maintain their sense of importance, validation is not simply pleasant, it becomes psychologically necessary. During the earlier stages of the relationship, the empath often provides this validation naturally. Their attention, emotional investment, and willingness to understand the narcissist create a steady stream of reassurance that the narcissist is valued, admired, or at least emotionally significant. Over time, the narcissist becomes accustomed to this constant feedback. Even when conflict occurs, the empath's continued engagement still communicates that the narcissist matters enough to fight for, explain things to, or emotionally react to. This keeps the narcissist feeling relevant and central in the relationship. The dynamic may feel chaotic, but the narcissist rarely feels ignored or emotionally invisible. But once the empath begins stepping back and reducing emotional engagement, the environment changes in ways the narcissist finds deeply uncomfortable. The familiar responses that once confirmed their importance start to fade. Compliments, reassurance, emotional arguments, and long conversations become less frequent or disappear altogether. Instead of reacting intensely, the empath becomes calm, selective, and emotionally self-contained. For the narcissist, this sudden lack of validation can create a powerful urge to restore what has been lost. They may start paying closer attention to the empath's behavior, searching for signs of emotional openness they can reconnect with. Sometimes they become more charming, attentive, or cooperative in an attempt to trigger the reactions they once received so easily. The underlying drive is not always about genuine change, but about restoring the emotional validation that once reinforced their sense of control and significance. The final shift that transforms this dynamic is the moment an empath begins to operate from genuine self-respect. For a long time in narcissistic relationships, empaths often prioritize understanding the other person over protecting their own emotional well-being. They tolerate behaviors that conflict with their values because they believe patience, compassion, or loyalty will eventually create change. They give second chances, explain their feelings repeatedly, and try to keep the relationship stable even when they feel drained or misunderstood. A narcissist gradually becomes comfortable within this pattern. They may assume the empath will always stay, always forgive, and always try again, no matter how difficult the situation becomes. This assumption quietly reinforces their sense of control. The empath's kindness begins to look from the narcissist's perspective like permanent access. As long as the empath continues prioritizing the relationship over their own boundaries, the narcissist rarely feels pressure to change their behavior in any meaningful way. But when the empath begins to develop stronger self respect, the energy of the relationship shifts in a noticeable way. Self respect changes how the empath views their own time, emotional investment, and personal value. They no longer feel responsible for managing another person's moods or repairing every conflict. Their decisions begin to reflect what is healthy for them rather than what keeps the narcissist comfortable. This internal change is often quiet but extremely powerful. The empath becomes less tolerant of manipulation, less reactive to criticism, and less willing to stay in situations that violate their boundaries. Their presence carries a sense of calm confidence rather than emotional urgency. For the narcissist, this shift can feel confusing because the person who once revolved around the relationship is now centered within themselves, and that stability removes many of the emotional levers the narcissist once relied on. In conclusion, when an empath learns to detach emotionally, protect their energy, and honor their own self respect, the entire dynamic with a narcissist begins to quietly and deeply shift. The narcissist who once thrived on control, emotional reactions, and constant validation suddenly encounters boundaries they cannot manipulate, silence they cannot provoke, and an absence of the supply they once took for granted. What follows is not revenge or aggression, but a subtle reversal of power. The narcissist may become fixated on regaining attention, compliance, or approval, often without fully understanding why. By standing firm in emotional detachment, establishing steady boundaries, and centering their own worth, the empath removes the fuel that sustains the narcissist's dominance. Over time, the narcissist may begin to orbit the empath's calm, self assured presence, attempting to reclaim a control that no longer exists. This is not about cruelty or manipulation. It is about reclaiming peace, dignity, and personal power. When an empath truly values themselves above the narcissist's games, the relationship dynamic transforms completely, leaving the narcissist chasing what they can no longer command and the empath free, steady, and fully in control of their own life.